Hey, everybody. Welcome to the next installment of the SDGC Final Fantasy Retrospective, where we talk about the mainline Final Fantasy games and look back on why we liked them, didn't like them, everything about them. Today, we are going over what many would call the first true great Final Fantasy 4, or Final Fantasy 2 for those that grew up in the 90s and lived in America. Um, this is a I don't think it's controversial to state that this is the first true game that made people fall in love with either the series, the genre, or stuff in general based about that. Final Fantasy IV is still looked back as one of the greats in a very long running series, and I am one of the ones that has a lot of love for this. Uh
Well, I mean, Final Fantasy IV was the first game in the series with an actual no bullshit epic story. I
yes,
mean, with a relatable protagonist who had nuance and character.
because that was
And
the
yeah,
first thing. Is This was the first Final Fantasy game, and at the time, one of the first JRPGs that had clearly defined characters with personalities, motives, a story that revolved around them. It felt epic in its scope and scale. I mean, you were going to the moon, you were traversing this wide open world, and it led you in a way that, looking back, it is pretty rigid, but at the time, compared to what came before it, you felt a lot of freedom. You had these wealth of secrets that you could stumble upon. Exploration felt rewarding, where you could come up against special bosses, secret caves, optional dungeons, summons. The world kept rewarding you for living in it. And beforehand, that had not really been the case in the genre, and especially not in Final Fantasy.
Yeah.
There was some genuine twists. There was an antagonist that felt very compelling, and you wanted to hate him. It gave us a lot of tropes that continued to this day. I could keep going on, but I feel like I should let someone else interject real
Yeah,
quick.
well, I mean, Final Fantasy IV has some of the most memorable characters in the series. I mean, Cecil is an incredibly memorable protagonist, both in terms of his design and even though his character arc is kind of over fairly early in the game. Just there's something about that whole starting out as the Dark Knight, changing into the Paladin form. His character
And it never
arc.
been done before.
Yeah.
Like, that was a huge, where it was instead of starting off as this shining beacon of good, like most RPGs, you were the bad guy.
Yeah.
And it was a
Are we the
redemption
baddies?
story.
Like,
Yeah.
that was the whole beginning, the whole first chunk of Final Fantasy IV is like, hey, are we maybe the Nazis in this game? Because
Right.
this isn't great. Like, I kind of just killed a little girl's mom, you know? It's
Like
is
that
okay?
opening when you're it was like the first, I want to call it, cinematic opening, where you had the airships and
The
you
Red
went
Wings.
and you stole the crystal, and you're like, huh,
That doesn't seem right.
Yeah, then you go
Something
burn a
seems
town
off.
down.
Then you go burn a
Yeah,
village.
you burn it.
Kill
go
a little
home,
girl's
you
pet
see
dragon, burn a village to the ground.
You go see your girlfriend very briefly, and you're like, baby, it's all working out. And then you see her weird grandpa with a huge red beard. He looks like Hacksaw Jim Duggan.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
And then
The
you
best
just
kid.
then you just a dick repeatedly until he has his moment of clarity.
And I
Yeah.
will, in as much as you can say about Cecil, I feel like the real star and people's love of the game
Kine.
stems from Kane.
Did you say
Yeah.
Kine?
It's kind.
Kane.
That's how they
It's
pronounce it
Kane.
in every time it's voice acted now.
But you know what? Every time it's pronounced,
Doesn't matter.
it's wrong.
You would think it should be
So-
Kane because, like, Cain Abel is how it's spelled
No,
out, but I'm
it's
gonna
not
keep
there.
saying Kine because that's how they
Kane.
pronounce it.
Guys,
in
if
voice
we're
acting.
setting a precedent right now for only using the correct pronunciation of Final Fantasy names, I know that we're gonna get to 5, but we are referring to that man as Butts. If
Yeah.
we're sticking to the original, this is his canonical name.
It's
You don't
there's
get
a
the
lot of
dude
this era of Final Fantasy characters where there are multiple pronunciations, and we're gonna be stumbling over this. It's fine. Like,
Well, I'll say this: Cain, as he should be known, is one of the first Final Fantasy characters that I consider to be just an absolute fascinating character study, because it was really the first time, like, he was really, I think, even more so than Leon in Final Fantasy 2, the first true Final Fantasy anti-hero.
That
Yeah.
betrayal
Oh,
hurt
because-
early in the game.
Because
I mean,
Kane's betrayal hurts, and his unrequited love for Rosa, which is what kind of, and his jealousy of Cecil's relationship with Rosa, which really drives his antagonism throughout the majority of the game. Watching him struggle against Zemus's control is something that still sticks with me to this day. In fact, I mean, I think one thing that Final Fantasy IV really brought to the series was not just major character moments like that, but major character deaths. Like, this game,
Yep.
this game is drowning in death. It's a very
I mean,
dark game.
And even after the end, when you realize that a lot of it is redacted and revoked, it didn't detract from the impact of all of those scenes, whether it's Palom or Porum or oh man, Yang sacrificed in the tower.
Yeah.
Or Palom and Porum was the one that got me.
That
when
was
they
hard.
petrified themselves to keep the
Yeah.
walls from coming in, dude. I felt it. I was like, oh no,
It's a
no,
strong
like,
moment.
oh.
But yeah, I mean, like, if you look at Kine, he's the obvious ensemble dark horse of the cast, right? He is the fan favorite from Final Fantasy IV. He is an incredibly well written character. You're gonna make me laugh my ass off while I'm trying to talk here, John. This is badass character design. I mean, even on just the Super Nintendo little sprites, right? Like, this dude's in some badass blue dragon armor, and he leaps into the sky and comes down on people with a spear.
That's the thing.
How cool is that?
It was so damn cool. Like, he oozed cool. He
was that cool anti-hero, like on again, off again villain rival type character that gets to join the party. That's kind of like a very arch role for these types of games. But Kine was the first one in Final Fantasy to really work like that, and he's so good at it.
Yeah.
And
I really like that Kane was able to look that cool.
Oh,
Can we also? I think it also needs to be pointed out. This was the first game that actually gave the summon monsters personalities and character motivations and an actual role in the story.
They actually spoke, and were you like Odin?
Odin was the king. The king turns into Odin, and then Leviathan was the king of the summons, and it was like Asura was his queen, and you had the summon village, and I loved that. I loved those characters, or those creatures, those abilities, those spells being actually roped into the story and made a major plot point. With the character of Rydia, which was just and of course we received even more summon monsters that became staples throughout the series. Titan, Leviathan, Asura was Asura. This is the only game she appeared in, though. No Asura after this.
No, you're right. Yeah, I was gonna say
not there was no
6,
Asura.
no, not in 6.
Sylph was another one that became ubiquitous throughout the series. And I think the other thing that needs to be mentioned is that this is the first Final Fantasy. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't remember anything like this from 2 or 3, but the first Final Fantasy that really embraced futuristic technology in a medieval setting.
Well, I mean, 1 and 2 both have the sort of shift towards weird sci-fi things late in the game. Both of those games have you seeing bases that feel like abandoned futuristic technology. It's that very 1970s sci-fi approach.
4 continues to ramp it up. Yeah,
4 is
like Lost Babel and
the Giant of Babel, which by the way, let's just point out, first game where you fight a giant fucking robot.
Yeah.
I mean,
I like
just a giant robot. That giant sphere boss too.
Yeah, the CPU of the giant robot.
Literally, we're just fighting a giant computer.
That's all it is.
I like the slow but sure, sort of leap away from Tolkien-esque fantasy aesthetics, or at least twisting them. Like, they didn't want to abandon it wholesale, so you still have gnomes, and the gnomes live underground, but the gnomes can help you fix a spaceship that goes to the moon.
Yeah.
They start getting weird.
However, one thing I want to point out that I think 4 really brought up and made truly special, even though they existed in previous games, the crystals and the 4 elemental fiends.
Yes,
The
the 4
elemental
archfiends are are a huge jump up from the first set in the original game.
Like even the first one, the Lich, when you become a paladin, and that moment when you cross back over the bridge and he revives himself and he's the zombie Lich.
Yeah, and Scarmiglione attacks you from behind.
Scarmiglione. So there was
Scarmiglione, Ruby Conte, Barbara Chia, and fucking Cognazzo. Yeah.
And I love and they beyond just they were impactful into the story. Like when you find out that Cognazzo was impersonating the king of your land.
Yeah.
He was the one manipulating everybody. Or I love that Rubicante had that.
He was noble.
I want to say stereotype. Yeah, he was very noble.
He was
that's one of my favorite tropes in these games is the noble bad guy who heals you and wants to fight you on fair terms.
Well, I think one of my favorite moments in the entire game was when you found out that Dr. Lugai transformed Edge's parents into monsters, and Rubicant found out about it, and he was furious. He cursed Lugai and he apologized to Edge before fighting him. He said, had I known about this, I would have allowed it to happen. Which unlike in a way, like really made me feel bad about wanting to fight him. Because I was like, in another time and place, I feel like Rubicant could have been an ally.
Yeah, especially when what you've gone through with like Kine already, you know, I mean, we already have.
He's like the opposite of Kine. He's like the bad guy that.
Yeah, are you guys talking about the fish from Kirby's Dream Land 2 when you say Kine? Is that what's happening?
I think that might be it, because he's not talking about Kane, who is the clear character we're talking about.
The Dragoon.
I'm trying to be right. I'm sorry.
It's interesting that you guys, when you remember Final Fantasy IV, and obviously, you know, I can see why it's the first thing, that it's all narrative. It's all character focused. It's all, this is the story that this game tried to tell. And at the exact same time, Final Fantasy IV was a really mechanically interesting game at the exact same time. It was an attempt to take what was done in 1 with the Warriors of Light, who are whatever sort of class you want them to be, and in 3 with the job system, and say, well, that's great, and we love that malleability of having like these different classes that all the characters are, but it's very free of personality. And 4's solution was say, well, instead of having characters that can take on whatever role you want, what if we had an enormous cast that all of them filled specific roles, where you do have a bard, you have the dragoon, you have the summoner, you have the martial artist, and that's something that, unfortunately, the version of 4 that we grew up with didn't really explore that in a really interesting way, because it was dumbed down.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, when you're a Dark Knight as Cecil, you don't have the ability to even use the Dark Blade ability, because they thought we would be too dumb and kill ourselves with it. Like,
and then you know, eventually I personally think that the definitive version of Final Fantasy IV is Final Fantasy IV Advance. That's the sort of best balance of all of the stuff that they added on in later releases, while still having.
Is that the one with Scorpion Zeramus?
Yes. Yeah. And like in the optional like Dark Tower dungeon that you get at the end. There is also a 3D remake of Final Fantasy IV that not only makes everything insanely difficult, but also tries to add to the story and add more to a character who we haven't talked a lot about, the Golbez.
Golbez, one of my favorite antagonists in Final Fantasy history, and he's not even the final boss. But he is so good.
I think Final Fantasy excels in the antagonists that aren't actually the final boss.
Yeah.
When Golbez first when Golbez first shows up, anybody playing Final Fantasy IV for the first time thinks, okay, here's an evil knight in dark armor with a funeral dirge theme, and he's gonna come and he's gonna be like, I'm evil and I want all the crystals. And that's his motivation at first, right? But then, spoiler alert for a fucking, 23-year-old game, or however old Final Fantasy IV is.
27 years, isn't it? 27.
That's really depressing. Let's not go there anymore. But that's super depressing to me. But when you find out that Golbez is your biological brother, you're both the son of Kluya, and the grandchildren of Fusoya, if memory serves me correctly. When you find out that Golbez is your brother, it throws everything into a brand new light for me. And Fusoya.
And one thing that really has to be pointed out about that, John, is that now it's such an eye-rolling cliche that you are related to the bad guy, but at the time it wasn't.
Nobody was doing that.
Dope.
He was
Darth Vader all over again. It was so great. Like,
he's anime Darth Vader.
You were his brother, and it was. Nowadays, looking back, it's like, oh yeah, isn't that the case that you actually have a magical tie to the bad guys? But back then, it was a mind-blowing moment. Yeah, and I want to go back to what John said about how we keep talking about the narrative, because this is the first RPG that I ever remember where the story overtook the mechanics of the gameplay, and you wanted to play. You justified the grind because you needed to see how the next plot point would play out. It made the grind more bearable for me as a kid, because I had to go fight hours of random battles to save up enough gold to upgrade my equipment, to learn a new spell, to do whatever. But it was worth it, because who knew what was going to happen at the end of that dungeon?
Can I also point, speaking of dungeons, by the way, Finn, because if I don't say it now, I'm going to forget it. Can we just all agree that the Lunar Subterrane is one of the finest final dungeons in the entire series?
Oh, one of the best.
Absolutely.
One of the best in RPGs, because it's one of the few final dungeons in the Final Fantasy series too that isn't needlessly punishing. Like there are always these like wonderful, thematically interesting Final Fantasy final dungeons, but they all kind of suck. Like,
and then there's Ultimisia's Castle. Like,
there's Ultimisia's Castle. Such a great idea. So interesting. So miserable to play.
For me, the Lunar Subterrane is right up there with Kefka's Tower.
I was going to say, it's like the second one for me. Well, Kefka's Tower.
I agree.
And the fascinating thing, and people don't realize this, I didn't the first time I played it, but there are enemies in there, like the mind and the breath enemies, that are actually manifestations of Zemus's consciousness throughout that dungeon.
I didn't realize that as a kid, but when I realized that later on, you're like, oh my god.
It's crazy. And plus that music and just like it is. I mean, so, and the fact that you fly there on what is probably the best airship in the entire series is just
the Lunar Whale.
Oh, it's so good.
Do you realize that we haven't talked about the fact that this is the first game ever to have the active time battle system?
Oh my god!
It's the original.
That's how much there is about 4, like in terms of how much of a jump forward it was, restrictive as it could be in some ways. First game in the series with the active time battle system, which to me is still the definitive Final Fantasy battle system, because it was used 4 all the way up through 9.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So I mean that's the longest stretch in the series that any single battle system
defined the genre.
It defined the genre for an entire decade.
I mean, that's insane that we didn't even like realize that this was the game that was its originator, because there's so much to talk about 4. And I love the travel mechanics. This game threw different vehicles at you. You had the hovercraft, you had the regular airship, then you had airships that had modifications like the drill and the plating so you could go underground. This was also the first one that had multiple world maps. You had the overworld, the underworld, and outer space. You had
the fucking moon.
It was absolutely mind-boggling how much content this game packed in, especially because this came out like 1.5 years after 3 on the Famicom. Like, can you just imagine going from that to the other? It was the first time that a next generation system truly felt that it could really help the genre. Like Mario World from Mario 3 felt like a natural progression, but comparing Final Fantasy 3 to Final Fantasy 4, it was
a true leap
of the genre.
And for people here, anybody outside of Japan, this was a leap from Final Fantasy 1.
Right. Yeah. That's the other thing.
But it felt crazy at the time.
We had Final Fantasy 2. And before that, I think, before this came out, because I got it for Christmas back when Square Enix had a mail-in call catalog that came in games and you had to call the hotline and get it mailed to you.
God, we're so
what a time. The last RPG I played right before that was Dragon Quest IV.
Yeah.
And you know, I feel like to kind of wrap this whole conversation up, we
probably should.
Well, no. Real quick. I think we should end the conversation as the game ends by a very quick mention of how Zeramus is still to this day one of the most epic final bosses in any JRPG ever. I mean, when you've got a final boss like Zeramus, where literally apparitions of other characters that you've met throughout the game appear to lend you support and aid before you fight him, and you've got the classic Final Fantasy theme playing, and that incredible moving background, which is the first time something like that had ever been done in a Final Fantasy game.
Fucking Flaming Lips concert bullshit going on in the background.
Is literally shaking with anger. Literally like shaking with anger at the at the heroes and all the support they're receiving. Just that final, to this day, like I still love that.
You know what, you're not wrong. That is such an amazing moment because it brought the whole game full circle, where every character that had ever come into contact with you and land that you helped, like it felt like this was the culmination of everything you had just gone through, and it was leading to that one moment. You are 100% correct on that.
Man, Final Fantasy IV is also the moment where Hiroyuki Ito at Square, and this is like Hiroyuki Ito, he's still there. He's one of the last dudes from the real early
old
80s.
Guard,
Old Guard, yeah. The first game he ever worked on for them was Aliens for the MSX2. And this was the moment where he transitioned over from being the sound designer, sort of like consultant on these things, to a core mechanic designer. And Final Fantasy IV was the beginning of his career as like, I'm going to create the battle systems for Final Fantasy games. ATB was his, and then he's the one who made the battle system in Final Fantasy V, which we're going to talk about next time.
Next time on Dragon Ball Z.
Definitely next week. Pay no attention to the fact that nothing will change from this video to that.
I don't leave my house. Ever.
Oh wait, we should we can't end until we do our where would you rank it in the easy top five. Four is easily upper echelon, like top tier for me.
Oh yeah,
way better than 10. Just so
I agree 100%.
I would say four is definitely top half, maybe top quarter for me. It's a really damn good game.
I'm just
and John, you know what? And there's a reason we never talked about the after years.
I'm with
because
what are you talking about?
I'm not talking about anything.
Exactly. You talking about fan fiction over here? Come on, man. We don't count that stuff.
John, what about when Cecil and Rosa have a baby?
How do you feel about this one? I like 8 more than 4.
All right.
You know what? You know what? Once again, controversial take. You're not entirely
would you say something so controversial yet so brave, Anthony.
I think John's gonna come through my computer monitor and
I will not agree with you that
think about those takes real quick, Anthony.
It's not better than 4 for me, but I actually respect 8 more than most.
It's gonna be interesting when we get to 8 because 8 is better than
8 is I think it's better than people give it credit. But yeah, let's roll out.
Let's call it for now before John breaks out of his shirt over the bad takes.
Actually, I would love to see John literally just Hulk out on a show and just, what are you talking about?
Let's just close it out.